Well, that's a tough act to follow. For 30 years, I've been an investigative reporter, uh, in-depth investigative reporter. What that means is I don't chase semen-stained dresses or the scandal du jour. I don't want to be part of the wolf pack fighting for my scrap of meat. I gravitate towards topics that tend to be off the radar screens of other reporters. I prefer this because it gives me time to think and to dig and to think and to come up with stories that when people read them, they will remember them. You might say I aspire to be the Alice Waters of investigative reporting. Slow food, not fast food. Fresh ingredients, not recycled or composite ingredients. Now, admittedly, in this age of instant news and opinion, you might say that my fate may not look very good for the long term. But I've been challenging conventional wisdom all my life, and in stories particularly. And so it was about a decade ago when I got a call from a public servant that I truly admire, the head of a state pharmacy board, of all things, who called me and said, there are babies dying in Haiti, and nobody gives a damn. Well, David Work gave a damn. And even though these babies weren't dying in his state of North Carolina, he cared, and I cared. And I decided to do something about it. Now, the conventional wisdom, again, was that this was a story nobody really cared about. Everyone knew that Haiti was the last stop on the road to hell. And what's a few more bodies? Well, I'm a pretty stubborn guy. And when my overseers at 60 Minutes, where I worked at that time, expressed, well, the feeling that maybe this isn't the right story for you, I'm too stubborn for that. I decided I'm going to do this. I'm going to be like David Work. And I'm going to pursue this because nobody else was pursuing it. So off I went to Haiti. My correspondent went to Martha's Vineyard. That was his island. I went to Haiti. And I would have it no other way, I should tell you. I fell in love with the place. But what I discovered when I was down there was some of the more horrifying things that I've ever uncovered as a reporter. Mothers were giving their babies poison. They thought they were giving them medicine to make them feel better, but it was poison. And when they didn't feel better and they got worse, they fed them more and more, and they died an agonizing death. And I went down there, and I'm standing in the middle of this horror, and I'm thinking, why am I the only guy down here? Well, I mean, people know about this. Someone needs to do something about it. Well, I can't begin to tell you how heartbreaking it was to be interviewing those mothers as they told me those stories. Now, what had happened was some entrepreneur had figured out a way to make more money by substituting a safe ingredient, by substituting an unsafe ingredient, antifreeze in essence, which mimicked a safe substance, which is commonly in medicine and in household goods. Well, I would later discover that that kind of thing had been going on for years and decades, and very little was done about it. So I had the heartbreak, which is an important part of any story. You've got to get people to care. I had that. Now I had to figure out who the perpetrator was. That was not easy. That's when I came to learn about the supply chain, the global supply chain. Our previous speaker talked about the supply chain in the United States. I was learning about the supply chain globally and how it worked and who the enablers were. And the enablers turned out to be people in entities that you would not expect. Governments were enablers. institutions. It continued to happen, and ultimately, with the help of a very courageous Deputy Commissioner of the FDA, I was able to figure out where the path led, and that path led to China. Now, I remember the Deputy Commissioner, Mary Pendergast, on camera, looking in the camera, and she says, you know, if we don't do something about this, this is going to happen to other mothers and to other babies and to other people. We must do something about it. And you know, if we don't, you can even find, I bet you could even find this thing in toothpaste. Well, 10 years later, everything she said turned out to be true. It did end up in our toothpaste, and it did end up in medicine. 10 years later, I was in the New York Times office. I had since moved on. And I'm reading an article about all these patients that were dying in Panama. And the article said that, well, they were dying, and it was unclear why, but it was probably just a mistake, some kind of error. And I'm thinking, no, it wasn't. You're not going to have an error like that where you put antifreeze into medicine. It's not like, you know, you have a factory where there's one pot here of medicine and one pot of poison, and somebody, you know, nudged it over and a little bit fell over in there and it ended up in the medicine. No. Within 48 hours, I had convinced my editors at the Times to send me down to Panama, and off I went. And I discovered that it was, in fact, the same ingredient that had ended up in the medicine in Haiti that had killed all the babies. And once again, it led me on a path to China. And once again, nothing seemed to happen. Nothing really happened in the 10 years in Haiti. Why? Because people had other priorities. Governments had other priorities. The United States government had other priorities. It's not like our health officials, our government didn't care. They did care. They tried to do something about it, but China was a big player on the international stage, and there was only so much pushing they cared to do at that time. The Chinese really didn't care. These weren't their patients. There were people that were dying. I'm not sure why they didn't care, but they didn't, and nothing was done. So 10 years later, it happened again. And as I discovered, it happened in other places around the world, in Nigeria, and Bangladesh, and India. And in fact, it had happened in the 1930s in the United States, which led to significant reform of how we oversaw and regulated drugs. So while we recognized the problem in this country, it continued on around the world. But there was always a feeling that, well, it could never happen here. So yeah, we care because we're a country, for the most part, of caring people, and when we don't like to see people suffer. And you know, I believe that, but you know, there still remain much to be done. And I think it all came home to roost when the toothpaste issue came in. And it turned out the antifreeze was being put into toothpaste by the Chinese and sold all around the world. And some of that toothpaste ended up in the United States. And when that happened, I mean, people didn't die from that. But it did somehow grab the attention of this country and government officials in a way that the other stories hadn't. And another reason for the attitude change, and another reason why we're having a meeting like this today, I want to believe it's true, is because of what happened with heparin. Because that came into this country, and it was another kind of counterfeit ingredient that ended up in this incredibly important drug that so many thousands of Americans use and depend on to live to the next day. And it turned out there was a counterfeit ingredient in that, and it came from China too. I'm happy to report that things have changed, though, given even those two incidents in the last 10 years. Initially, pharmaceutical industry, was very reluctant to cooperate with me. I couldn't get phone calls returned. They're in a difficult position. You know, they understand that there's a problem out there, but they don't want to undermine confidence in their products. On the other hand, they're worried about counterfeiting. So I think they've come to the conclusion that there are opportunities when you work with reporters to publicize this and not scare the dickens out of people, but to do the kind of work that'll lead to, you know, the kind of reform that'll make our drug supply chain safer. The United States is paying much more attention to this. I could say that China's paying more attention to it, and I do believe they are, and I mean, they did execute the head of the Chinese FDA. That wasn't my intent when I got into this story. But it is now the standard for investigative reporters everywhere. If there ain't an execution, don't apply for a Pulitzer Prize. But at any rate, things have changed, and the media is interested in it, the government's interested in doing it, in doing more, and that's why we're having a meeting here. And you know, I hope that 10 years from now, I'm not standing up here telling you another sad story about people dying from bad medicine. Thank you.